Good afternoon and welcome to this distinguished lecture by Professor Juan Manuel Santos, Nobel Peace Prize laureate and recent president of Colombia. This marks the start of his professorship in this university and acknowledges his role as co-founder of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network. I'm Sabina Al-Khair of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, a research center in international development, which has the honor to host this lecture. And we're very pleased and grateful that Professor Sarah Whatmore, the head of the Social Sciences Division and Professor of Environment and Public Policy, will chair this distinguished lecture and the ensuing discussion. As head of the Social Sciences Division, Professor Whatmore provides vision and strategic leadership across all the social sciences of the university. Since joining Oxford to take up a statutory chair of Environment and Public Policy in 2004, Professor Whatmore has also served as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education, the university's academic champion for public engagement with research, the division's Associate Head of Research, and as head of the School of Geography and the Environment. And she's an active fellow of several learned societies, such as the British Academy and the Academy of Social Sciences. So it's lovely and somehow apt that this lecture involves both a chair who champions public engagement and a president who has been engaging research across the social sciences. Both can confidently weave this journey between detailed analysis and perceptive and nuanced attention to current events. Such qualities are very needed in these times, and so won't you please welcome Professor Whatmore.
Thank you, Sabina, for that warm welcome, and it's a distinct pleasure to be here and to see you all. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Juan Manuel Santos, who will be giving this distinguished lecture. One of the real pleasures of my current role as head of the Social Sciences Division is to approve applications and nominations for visiting professorships. It's a special pleasure to welcome Juan Manuel Santos in that regard. So 5 years ago, he was serving as president of Colombia, and our speaker came to Oxford to launch with Professor Amartya Sen the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, MPPN, whose secretariat is OPHI, the wonderfully acronamed OPHI, the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, the research centre that organised this event. At that meeting, he endorsed a multidimensional approach to fighting poverty in all its forms and dimensions, and charged the network here founded to work throughout the world to galvanise concerted force to impact poverty. Whereas 16 countries were present at that time, the MPPN now has participants from 57 countries, plus 15 international agencies. Under President Santos' leadership, the government of Colombia was a pioneer in using the Multidimensional Poverty Index as an integral part of Colombia's national plan, and in using it to drive policy. As president, he turned his formidable energies and skills to fighting the many disadvantages that blight the lives of poor people. He chaired a round table of ministers engaged in ending poverty in all its dimensions, and used Colombia's regularly updated Multidimensional Poverty Index to manage change at an accelerated pace. Multidimensional poverty fell sharply during his term of 8 years, from affecting over 30% of citizens in Colombia to 17%. And many other countries were inspired to innovate similarly in their contexts. Amartya Sen appeals to us not to become coolly accustomed to poverty and destitution, but rather to turn with determination to redress it. And I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished guest as co-founder of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, a South-South network focused on ending poverty in all its dimensions. Former President Santos also famously turned his indomitable courage to building the peace in Colombia. In 2016, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Juan Manuel Santos for his, and I quote, resolute efforts to bring the country's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end. This work required untiring efforts. Even when a referendum rejected one particular peace deal, this work did not falter, but continued with a strong will and drove an historic change. So we have here a speaker who, like many researchers across the university, is no stranger to complexity, to intractable problems, and to the need for sophisticated and determined efforts and means to solve them. Professor Santos is an economist, and his leadership on poverty especially bears the marks of a curious and rigorous mind. In a university and a division of social sciences focused on the impact of our research in the world, we note with interest that he is also a journalist, thus knows the importance of using scholarship to catalyse action, to change hearts as well as minds. This distinguished lecture opens a new chapter, and I ask you to welcome Juan Manuel Santos to his new role as visiting professor in the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. And I call upon him now to deliver his distinguished lecture on the title, Reducing Poverty and Building Peace in Colombia, Inextricably Linked Processes. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, it's my honor now to call on the former President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for this great opportunity. I want to especially thank the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and also say hello to all the members of the faculty and all the students. And I feel extraordinarily honored to stand in front of you today. I know that very important people have been here in this magnificent building, and what a pleasure it is for me to be here today. All of us want success and happiness. And very early in life, I asked myself, what is success? What is happiness? And I discovered that it's not how much money you have in your bank account. It's not how much power you have. And I found a marvelous definition that I want to share with you. It's a definition by a great writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says, what is success? It's to laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. With this definition, I said to myself, what do I do with my life? That's how public service attracted me. And when I became president, every leader must have a vision for his country. And I had a vision of a country with 3 pillars: peace, social justice, and education. The 3 are very much linked. I will not talk today about education. I will only say that I made education free for every boy and girl in Colombia from kindergarten to 11th grade. And I put the budget of education as the #1 in the national budget for the last 5 years, first time in the history of Colombia. But let me talk about peace and social justice. Peace was thought to be impossible. We have had a war, an armed conflict, internal armed conflict of more than 50 years. But I thought that there's nothing impossible. We can make possible the impossible. And how did we go about this? The story starts 50 years ago. I was in the Navy. And in the Navy, I was taught many things. Among them, I became a bagpiper. The British Embassy, our Navy is very much designed by the British and gave us 8 bagpipes, and I was a recruit. And they told me, you have to learn how to play the bagpipe, and I learned. But much more important, they taught me how to sail. And I think that there's a phrase by a very renowned Roman philosopher, Seneca, that captures the essence of what I learned. I will quote him: ignoranti quem portum petat, nullus sus ventus est, which essentially means, if you don't know what port you are steering toward, no wind is favorable to us. I am inclined to a more positive interpretation. When we know which port we are steering toward, even the most contrary winds can help us reach it. This is a lesson for life, for everybody, in your personal life, in your companies, in your families, in government. 20 years later, I found the port of destination where I wanted to go. There are incidents in one's life that in some way determines your future. There were 2 events. I was recently named the first Minister of Foreign Trade. We had a very closed economy. We wanted to open the economy, and we wanted to attract investment. We organized a conference, a big conference in New York, and in the middle of the conference, with all the potential investors, some news about a very big bomb in a commercial center in Bogota came, and of course, the conference failed. And one of the CEOs of one of the big companies said to me, Minister Santos, you will never have important investment in Colombia if you don't end that war. Some months later, I was chairman of the 8th Conference of the United Nations for Trade and Development, the UNCTAD. And when my chair ended, I had to give the chair to Nelson Mandela. So I went to South Africa. I had a meeting with him one afternoon. That morning, I put on the television, and there was an incredible live program. The victims and the perpetrators were meeting each other. Some of them were shouting to each other, others were embracing. And I thought this was really weird. And I asked Mandela that afternoon, what is this all about? We had a programmed a meeting for 20 minutes. We ended up talking more than 4 hours. And he told me exactly the same what this CEO had told me. You will never have good development in Colombia unless you end the war. And he explained to me what he had done. So there I said, my port of destination is peace in Colombia. So I started to see how can we achieve that peace. I started to plan each step, studied all the peace processes that had occurred in the world and in Colombia, why they had failed, what lessons could you get from one or the other. There are always different conditions. And we started to discover something very important. In any negotiation, you need the correct conditions for this negotiation to be successful. And you can create those conditions. And I had identified some of those conditions, 4 conditions that were necessary to have a successful negotiation and a successful peace process. Very briefly, we needed to have the correlation of military forces in the favor of the state. We needed to have the heads of the guerrillas, the commanders, convinced personally that for them, on a personal basis, it was better to negotiate peace than continue the war. In today's asymmetrical war, in today's world, asymmetrical wars need necessarily the support of the region and, if necessary and if possible, of the whole world. And fourth, we needed to recognize politically that there was an armed conflict. So I went slowly building these conditions. In the first condition, it was simply a matter of making our armed forces more efficient. And in the second condition, we had never been able to touch any of the commanders, what we call the high-value targets. So I came, when I was designated Minister of Defense back in the year 2006, I came to London. And I went to the Prime Minister and said, will you help me? And he said, what do you need? And I said, I need what you British have best, intelligence. Please advise me on how to have a better intelligence. And so he sent me to a very distinguished Oxford graduate. He was the head of MI6, Sir John Scarlett. And he gave me a crash course on intelligence. And I went back to Colombia and did what he told me I should do. He said, you have that American system, which is very inefficient. We in the British have a centralized system. We don't put the CIA to compete with FBI. No, we have a centralized system. That's what you need, and that's what we needed. And we started being much more effective in the war. And we needed to weaken the FARC in order to bring them to the negotiating table. The intelligence was so good that we did some fabulous operations. For example, there were 15 kidnapped people in the middle of the jungle by the strongest guerrilla, the largest guerrilla of the Americas. And we rescued them from the middle of the jungle without one shot. It was a military intelligence operation. And I am happy to say that I think is Ingrid Betancourt here? Oh, here she is. She was one of the persons who was rescued 6 years, kidnapped in a jungle by the guerrilla, FARC of the guerrilla. We rescued her, thanks in many ways to the way British intelligence taught us to make the military operations. And we started striking the heads of the guerrillas, and then they were convinced that negotiating was better for them. The third condition was done by diplomacy. When I became president, we had no diplomatic relations, no commercial relations, no trade relations with our neighbors, with Venezuela, with Ecuador. With Brazil, we had very bad relations. We changed that all. We changed completely, and we created the conditions for the region to support the peace process in Colombia, and after the region, the whole world. The United Nations, the Security Council, the British were especially favorable to the peace process. They became the penholders in the United Nations, in the Security Council, of all the resolutions that had to do with the Colombia's peace process. That's why I'm so grateful for what Great Britain has done for Colombia in this peace process. And so we had that third condition. And the fourth condition was the condition of recognizing politically the presence of an armed conflict. That was necessary because we wanted to negotiate, and this is the first time that any country has negotiated a peace process under the umbrella of the Rome Statute. And in order to be able to apply what they call transitional justice, which is a different kind of justice, it's designed precisely to facilitate the resolution of armed conflicts. We needed to recognize that there was an armed conflict, something that my predecessor had not accepted. So we did recognize it, and I will tell you a little later why this was also important for the fight against poverty. So when the conditions were there, we then started to apply the necessary tactics, the procedures. It's very important in any negotiation to have a good process and good procedures. There, I was blessed by the advice of 5 foreign advisors who were with me throughout the whole process. One of them was a professor of negotiation of Harvard University. One of them graduated in Cambridge, and the other 3 graduated in this university, in Oxford. Some of them are here. Shlomo Ben-Ami, who's right there, and Joaquin Villalobos. They have been my advisors, and Jonathan Powell, who was the chief of staff of Tony Blair, very determinant in the Northern Ireland peace process, was the third one, all of them from this university. So I'm very grateful to the university for the support that we had. And they were really good advisors on everything, but especially on the process, on procedures. And we started to say, let's test the willingness of the FARC to really negotiate. Let's negotiate the agenda first, secretly. If they don't filter, if they don't leak the negotiations, then they're serious. We negotiated for 1.5 years, and for the first time ever, they never leaked any of that information. We decided to apply something that I call the Rabin doctrine. Rabin, the former Prime Minister of Israel, when he said, "I will negotiate with Arafat as if there is no terrorism, and I will fight terrorism as if there is no peace process." And I told the FARC, we will negotiate with the same conditions. They wanted a ceasefire. I said, no, we will have a ceasefire at the end. It was a difficult decision, but I think it was necessary. We decided to adopt the scheme that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And there we had some problems because we applied that same scheme to the communications. And the communications was one of the problems that I had during the whole process, because public opinion in every peace process is very skeptical and very critical of any concessions you make to your counterpart. And especially in my case, that I had been elected president because I was very effective as a hawk. And suddenly I became a dove, and that was a very radical change. I remember Mr. Shlomo Benami telling me in very crude but real words saying, President Santos, you can continue to be very popular. I had more than 80% favorabilities in the polls. Because you know how to make war. You have been successful. And you can keep showing the trophies. Every 15 days, every month, everybody will applaud and your polls will be very high for the rest of your government. Or you can risk it all. And you, for certain, will lose your political capital, or at least they will be very much diminished. And he said something which was quite shocking, and you might even lose your life, like what happened to Rabin and Sadat. But it's the only way you will finish the war. The only way. Otherwise, this will continue 20 or 30 years. And I took his advice, and I went the difficult path. And we started negotiations. There were other factors that were very beneficial. For example, we brought in the military that had always been a spoiler. We brought them into negotiation. Two of the generals, retired, very prestigious generals, I put as part of the negotiating team. And of course, the negotiation was a very difficult one, but finally, we managed to sign an agreement. And something happened. I had promised the Colombian people that I would put the agreement on a referendum. Big mistake. The Brexit had just happened 2 months earlier. I should have learned, but I didn't. I was stubborn. I thought because the polls all said 20% or 25% difference, I was going to win. I lost by a very small margin, very small, tiny, less than half of a percent, but I lost. And I said, what can I do? But I said, this is a 50-year war. So much effort, so much fake news and manipulation of the public opinion in the referendum. I underestimated the power of fake news. I thought the lies that were saying about the process were so outrageous that nobody would believe them. They believed them. And anyway, I said, I cannot simply say I declare my defeat and I have to continue. So I called the leaders of the no vote. They had said that they wanted peace, but another type of peace. I said, what is it, the peace that you want? We started negotiating. We incorporated many of the suggestions that they had, the big majority. We renegotiated with the FARC, and we finally signed a new agreement, and I didn't put it to a referendum. I was not obliged to put it, legally I was not obliged to put the peace agreement in a referendum. Our Constitution says you have to present it to Congress. I did that, which is the legal way to do it. The Congress approved it by an overwhelming majority, and now we are implementing the agreement. Of course, in the middle, between the date I lost the referendum and during the negotiation, a gift from heaven came, which was the Nobel Peace Prize. That was given not because I achieved peace, because at that time I didn't have the peace in my pocket, but because I'd never stop trying to achieve the peace. This is a very important message to you all. We never stopped trying, persevering, and that was a very important factor in being able to succeed. It's not a perfect peace agreement. No peace agreement is perfect. It's the negotiation of human beings, two parties that have been at war. And always, in any peace agreement, the key question is where you draw the line between peace and justice. And always there will be some people who want more peace and some people who want more justice. That has happened in every single peace process. But the important thing is that we found what I call a correct equilibrium between peace and justice, and we're now implementing. Implementing a peace agreement is even more difficult. One thing is peacemaking, and another thing is peace building. Peace building needs a magic word called reconciliation. The Pope, who was also a great ally in this process, I visited him at least 5 times in the peace process, and I always said, if you really want to help me, go and give me a push over there in my country. And he said, I will go when I will be most needed, when you will need me the most. And he went after I had signed the peace agreement, the second one. He went and he spent 4 days in Colombia, and he said, he put the title of his visit, I come here to push the Colombians to give the first step towards reconciliation, because that is the most important and most difficult phase of a peace process. That's the phase we are in right now. And I say that reconciliation is like building a cathedral. It takes time, takes patience, and the agreement is a very sophisticated and ambitious agreement. It has the normal elements of any agreement, DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of the insurgency into political life, into civil life, but also has a transitional justice agreed for the first time ever between the two parties, and the two parties accept submitting to this justice. And not only that, but there's a very ambitious development plan, 15 years, 16 different regions, where the communities are the ones that have to prioritize the development plans. That is been made at this moment. By the end of this year, next month, it will finish, and they will start implementing those development plans next year. So in the reconciliation, then I go to the second pillar, social justice, the fight against poverty. Again, I go back, these incidents of life, I go back 43 years. I was a student at the London School of Economics, and Professor Amartya Sen was teaching a class that I went to the class, and I remember that class very well. I will not go into details, but I was so impressed by Professor Sen. And then I had the luck and coincidence of being his student also at Harvard back in 1981-82. And again, I was very impressed. So when I recognized the armed conflict, I did it through a law that put the victims in the forefront of the solution of the conflict. Their rights, the right to justice, the rights to reparations, the rights to the truth, and the rights to non-repetition. These are rights that have been established by the Rome Statute, but that law also created a special institutionality, institutions that are the ones that I used when again, by pure coincidence, I was contacted by Oxford, by Sabina, because I was eager to see how I could be more effective in bringing down poverty and extreme poverty and inequality. And I was searching all around, and they told me, well, there is Professor Sen, the Oxford Initiative for Fighting Poverty and Human Development, and I said, I would really like to know more about it. I came to Oxford. I met Professor Sen. I reminded him I was his student. He knew who I was. And I said, I want to apply your ideas and the ideas of OFI. And that's when we launched the network. And I got very enthusiastic about it. And I became a hands-on manager. And I think this is very important, because this was as important as the peace process in the sense that it complements the peace process. And if you want to have durable peace, you need more social justice. You need to bring down poverty and extreme poverty. So what I did was establish a procedure whereby all the ministers that were involved in the different decisions that addressed the strategy of multidimensional index. It was a different measurement of how to measure poverty and how to fight poverty, which became an extremely useful tool for the government, because then I had very specific and clear objectives of where to invest. And so I told the Minister of Education, go and do X and Y, or the Minister of Health, or the Minister of Housing, where the investment will have the biggest impact on fighting poverty. So it was a win-win situation from every point of view. It was an efficient social investment and an effective. So it produced very fast, good results. And we decided to continue measuring both multidimensional and monetary poverty. And it had a very, very big effect also in the monetary measurement. And relatively speaking, Colombia in the last 6 years has been the country that has been able to reduce poverty more in the region than any other country, and extreme poverty. We still have a long way to go. We still have too much poor people in Colombia and too much extreme poverty. But I think we are on the correct track. I now wish to become, if Sabina gives her blessing, an ambassador for the OFI around the world, because I think that the example of Colombia in the application of this methodology is something that many other countries can benefit from. And I'm very pleased to hear that the interest around the world is there. Mexico, I must say, was the first one to identify the necessity of changing the metrics. The Mexican Congress was the first one to approve a law that said that. So we are now, Mexico and Colombia, working together to see if we can promote that in many other countries. We brought down poverty in a very substantial way, a big percentage, and so we will have to continue that in order to also make reconciliation and the consolidation of peace more effective. So those two factors complement each other. You have a better social situation, then the causes of violence go down, and it's easier to maintain a peaceful environment. So, with this, I want to simply tell you, especially the students, that you should ask yourself, what is and what will be your port of destiny, our port of destination? Everybody should have a port of destination and try to fight for it, try to achieve it. Every storm, every foul wind, every force in the universe will help you get there. And I think there are many examples in the world that prove this. Today's polarized world is facing political upheaval, the threat of terror, threat of war. We see how the leader of the most important country in the world, that this country led the creation of the institutions that has maintained the world order for so many years after Second World War, that the leader of that country is now destroying those institutions. And what's going to happen to the world order? We see a China that is emerging, that has already switched from the low profile and bidding time that Deng Xiaoping had as a policy to a much more straightforward policy of, I want to be a world power. And they are becoming a world power. You see a Russia that in its decline is interested in the world disorder, because that will allow Russia to have more space in world politics. Just yesterday, they were commemorating 100 years of the signature of the Great War. And it's very, very worrisome that if you analyze what is happening today, this national populism, the attitude of manipulating the emotions of the people, and many of the aspects that we are seeing today are not very different from what the world was going through before the First World War. So, but the answer is not to give in into fear. It's not intolerance and hatred toward those who are different from you. On the contrary, this generation, the generation of your generation, cannot and must not retreat and give in to these regressive and sinister forces. Your generation must lead now, not tomorrow, now. And with this leadership, you must not divide, you must unite. And that leadership must be wise. And at your young age and what you're learning here will give you the instruments to be wise leaders. That is the responsibility you will carry, no matter your chosen profession. Your generation must have compassion, something that is very much needed in the world today. Your generation believes in the unifying power of a beautiful word, love. Love should unite everybody. Your generation sees diversity as a strength, and diversity is a factor of strength, not a weakness. You will do the right thing for the rest of us. That's what you should do. That's what we all expect, because you understand that this is not the moment to come apart. In today's world, it's the moment to come together. This is not the moment to turn away. It's the moment to reach out, especially right now. We have to reach out. This is not the time to disconnect. It's the time to connect. Differences in race, in creed, in sexual preferences cannot distract us from this essential, indisputable truth. We are all, and we can never forget, we are all humans. We are all one. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such an inspiring lecture. Professor Santos has very kindly agreed to answer some questions, and we will give this as long as there are questions, within reason, before we move next door to the Divinity School. If I could just ask you if you could identify yourself and indicate your affiliation, be that a department or a college, whatever it is. For those on the ground floor, we have some microphones that will come around. For those of you on the upper levels, I'm afraid we can't, in a speedily enough way, get microphones to you. So if you could just bear that in mind and speak up, particularly for the benefit of those who are engaging with this forum or on live stream. So please, questions.
Good evening, sir. My name is Eva Emma, and I am a business school student here at Oxford. My question to you is, you mentioned that there was a trade-off when you decided whether you had to choose peace or justice. Because what we think is, if there is peace, there would automatically come justice in our day-to-day activities. So what was the difference, why the trade-off was required, and why both were not related to each other?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
The trade-off between peace and justice.
Well, it's the paradox of a peacemaker. They're always, if you tell an insurgency that to lay down their arms and go to jail for 40 years, they will not lay down their arms, the conflict continues. So you need to be more lenient and to apply a different type of justice. Transitional justice is not the punitive justice that we are all accustomed to. It's more of a justice that repairs, and that's why the victims are so important. Transitional justice, what it does is it judges, it condemns. One of the conditions for the application of this type of justice is that people have to tell the truth. If they don't, they will go to a normal jail and have a normal punitive sanction. They have to also do a work to repair the victims. For example, instead of going to a jail that is the normal jail with pajamas and lines, you go and build roads in the areas where you operated, or you build schools, or you go and demine the areas for a certain moment of time, 8 years or 10 years. These are the type of punishments that are not in the traditional justice, but they are in the transitional justice. Many people don't like that. For example, in my country, many people object that the leaders of the guerrilla are now in Congress. Right now, I gave them 10 seats 5 in the Senate, 5 in the House of Representatives. And they wanted, no, they have to go to jail before. Well, this is a very ridiculous demand, because if they want to go into politics, and I would summarize the Colombian peace process with a photograph that was published after the last Congress elections of the commander of the FARC, the commander, by himself, unarmed, voting as the leader of a political party. That's exactly what a peace process is all about. Some people don't like it. As in Northern Ireland, many people didn't like it. And in South Africa, many people didn't like it. I remember President Clinton telling me that Mandela one time phoned him and said, "They're attacking me viciously." And I said, "Who? Your adversaries?" And he said, no, my own people, because he was too lenient in order to get an agreement. So there's always a discussion around that issue. This is the most important issue, but it's the only way to achieve peace.
Yes, just in front of the brass bar. If you could speak up. No, one behind you. Sorry, just behind you. There's a gentleman behind you, and then we'll come to you. Sorry, he had his hand up earlier.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your speech. My name is Arkan Keskin. I'm doing a master's in comparative and international education. So I would prefer, I really wanted to hear your comments on education a bit more. Anyways, my question is, how long has it been your dream to become the president, and how have you prepared yourself? What kind of personal preparation have you done, and how did you connect with your voters? Thank you.
How long did I prepare to become president? Well,
how long has it been a dream of yours? Since what age?
I had the opportunity of having a lot of experience, because I was a diplomat for a long time here in London. I was the head of the Colombian delegation to the International Coffee Organization. I was very young. I was then a journalist for some time, and then I became the first Minister of Foreign Trade. Then I was Minister of Finance in the most difficult moment of the Colombian economy in the last 100 years. And I had to take very, very harsh and unpopular decisions. I thought that would be the end of my political career, because I was the most unpopular Colombian in the whole of the territory. They used to burn my picture in every plaza in Colombia, and my kids, who were very small at the time, they asked me, "Father, in the television, why do they burn you all around the country?" I said, "Because the smoke goes up to heaven, and it's a homage to your father." Then I was Minister of Defense, and so when I was elected president, I had a bit of experience, and it's very important, because you don't improvise experience.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello. I'm Venezuelan, studying environmental management here at Oxford. And you mentioned that one of the preconditions for peace in Colombia was getting better relationships with your neighbors. And I wanted to ask you about Lloren Saleh, who during your presidency was traded or given to Maduro's government and was in prison for years and tortured. And I wonder if that type of situation was part of the preconditions for peace.
No, I didn't know about this person until he was in Venezuela. I'm very shocked by what happened to him. He was tortured, but he was not extradited. He was deported because he was illegally in Colombia. He had been there for much more time than his permission said, and he started to do some things according to the police, that caused one of the senators to accuse him, and so he was deported. But there's no transaction with Maduro. I did no transactions with Chavez or with Maduro. And I will tell you an anecdote. When I was probably the harshest critic of Chavez before I became president. You can read what I wrote about him, or what he told me, or he attacked me viciously. When I became president, I knew that I needed the region, but I didn't know how to break the ice with this person who had been such an adversary. And I said, I have to use, and this is an advice of a great British leader, Winston Churchill, use humor, wit, when you're in difficult situations. And that's what I did. When he sent me the message that, I sent him the message that I would like to have normal relations with him, because we had no diplomatic relations, no trade relations. He responded positively. He wanted to go to my inauguration. I said, no, not my inauguration, but I will invite you 3 days later to a very special place where Bolívar died, up north, a place called San Pedro Alejandrino. When he arrived, he was very flamboyant, and he arrived with 4 planes, 15 armored cars, and I didn't know how am I going to break the ice with him after so many insults from one side to the other. So when he arrived, he always made a statement to the press, and he took out a white flag and said, I come to make peace with Santos the day of his birthday. He turns 48. And I saw that on television. I said, I remembered the advice of Churchill, use wit to break the ice. And when he came and he wanted to embrace me, I was very serious. And I said, Mr. President, we have a big problem. And he was surprised, and he said, what happened? Your statements to the press put me in a terrible position. And he said, why? I only said I came to make peace with you, and in a special day, the day of your birthday, you're turning 48. Precisely, I'm turning 58, and my wife is going to be much more demanding. and that broke the ice. We had a very cordial relation, and that same day, we sat down, and he started to criticize Colombia's social policy and economic policy, and I said, listen, let's do what Reagan and Gorbachev did. Reagan sat down with Gorbachev in Geneva and said, I will never become a communist and you will never become a capitalist. But let's work together for a superior motive. In the case of Reagan and Gorbachev, was to reduce the nuclear arsenal. I said, let's work together for a superior motive, which is peace. And justice and history will judge, because I will never become a Bolivarian revolutionary and you will never become a liberal Democrat. But history will judge what model is more effective. I think history has made its judgment. You see the situation in Venezuela, which is, for us, the most serious problem. For Colombia, we have 2,200 live kilometers of border. We have more than 1 million Venezuelans living in Colombia. We have opened our arms and our hearts to Venezuelans. We will continue to do that, but we hope and we're pressing in every way possible to a peaceful transition as soon as possible in Venezuela.
Thank you. Did I see an arm down here? And then I've got 2 up here, and then I'll come back.
Great. Many thanks, President, for your talk. Very interesting. My name is Homero Paltan. I'm a doctoral student from the School of Geography. I just have one question. So this has been a conflict with regional implications. What has been the level of involvement of, well, apart from Venezuela, from the entire region in this peace-building process? And not just for signing the agreement, but what came after, or what's happening at present? What's the current level of involvement of all these, of all regional institutions? Thanks.
No, the regional institutions have been very ineffective. And not only with, they did not participate very much, besides giving political support to the peace process. But they have been very ineffective because the region is very much divided. There's no coordination among the region. We have a very awkward situation. We have a right-wing populist now in Brazil and a left-wing populist in Mexico, the two most important countries in the whole region. This is a big challenge for us. That's something we have discussed with many of the leaders. I just come from a forum, the Ibero-America Forum, with many of the former presidents saying, how are we going to manage this? What is going to happen in Brazil? We don't know. What's going to happen in Mexico? We don't know. But of course, these are the two biggest countries in the region, and we are very concerned of what might happen. In those circumstances, like in any circumstance where you are somewhat lost or don't know where to go, you should always consult your maps, and the maps are your values and principles. And I think it's you have to reiterate the values and principles of the democratic government, of democracy, freedom, liberty, and this is what can probably maintain us together.
So I have a sequence of three, beginning with young man at the front of the top row.
Mr. President, my name is Andres Diaz Silva, Colombian, a former MPPN, currently interning for Jonathan Powell. So I was very interested about the first precondition you mentioned about weakening the opponent for taking it to the negotiation table. Currently in Colombia, we see a new escalation of violence, especially with the ELN capturing the former FARC areas. If you had an open channel of communication to President Duque, would you advise him to sit at the negotiation table or rather enhance the military action against the ELN to push them into the table?
I made a promise to myself not to give advice to President Duque and not to criticize him. I say that there are three types of former presidents in Latin America. The ones who go out of power and want to seek power again. The second type is the one who goes out of power to criticize his predecessor. And the third one, the ones to go from one university to others telling stories. I'm the third one.
Next question is here. No. For those who didn't hear the question, it was what are the strategies now to integrate former guerrillas into society? That's a very rough translation.
This is a very, very important question. Fortunately, we had a very long experience in reintegrating combatants of the guerrillas and the paramilitaries. An experience that we have accumulated for more than 10 years. So we know how to do it. In the agreement, we were quite ambitious in giving the guerrillas some opportunities to reincorporate themselves into civil life. This is being done. Sometimes it takes more time than what we thought it would take because, for example, we have a problem with the guerrillas. The leaders of the guerrillas want to have the base together. The base wants to go home and want to be with their families. And so they don't agree on, for example, what type of training they should have. Will they want to be farmers or will they want to be industrial workers? And so problems of this sort has, in a way, delayed the process of reintegration, but it's going on. It's going on, I would say, normally you always have problems. Always you have a percentage who go back to, especially with the drug trafficking, to go back drug trafficking because it's very lucrative. But overall, I would say it's working quite well.
So we have one sitting there, yes. You've been waiting a long time. And then we have one over here.
Hello, my name is Luisa. I'm doing a master's in international tourism management in Northern Ireland, and I'm very happy to be here. I take the opportunity to give a big thanks because I'm from Colombia, from Cauca, one of the most affected regions in Colombia by the armed conflict. And I have seen by my own eyes how this peace agreement have benefit my region. And I really want to thank you for that because now we have a new hope and the big task to build a new country for this new generation. So my question is, what will be like your message for all these Colombian students, already we are Colombians, that we have like this task to contribute to peace building in Colombia?
What is it?
What can the new generation do to contribute to peace?
Well, study hard. Study hard and go back. Go back. Colombia is full of opportunities. I think we have been building the basis for a very, I would hope, a very strong takeoff. It's already taken off. Colombia, in the last years, has been the country with the best social indicators of the region. We are now going through an infrastructure revolution that is changing the competitiveness of the country. We have been able to have one of the strongest economies. For example, in the last year, there is the most implacable judge of any economy is called the markets. They have no heart. And when they see something that they don't like, they strike. How do you measure how the markets are seeing you? There's something called the spreads, the risk of investing in the country. Well, Colombia is the only country that during this year of upheaval, because you've seen what happened in Turkey, in Argentina, it's been difficult in Brazil, the only country where the spreads have gone down of all the countries in Latin America has been Colombia. So I think you have to persevere in building the peace, persevere in reconciliation, hopefully leave aside this polarization that unfortunately is present in Colombia also, not only in Colombia, almost all around the world, but in Colombia very strongly. You can contribute very much to build the bridges. You come from a university as prestigious as Oxford, the doors will be open.
We had a question on the ground floor in this quadrant. I think it's the hand leaning back, wearing glasses. Oh, there's two of you.
Which one?
Okay, let's go from the back forward. So the gentleman grabbing the microphone now, and then the woman can follow on, and then we'll come to you. I haven't forgotten you at the front. Yes, please.
Thank you. Miguel Larrota from the Criminology Center. I have I want to ask you about the decision not to submit to referendum the second agreement. I understand the reasons why you took that decision, but looking back now, to what degree do you think that decision took away precious legitimacy of the process? And that in turn made it more difficult to implement, and that maybe helped create the political environment that Colombia lives now.
We made an exercise with the leaders of the no vote and told them to submit all their proposals and their comments. We incorporated 95%. Out of 58 proposals, we incorporated 56. What were the ones that we did not incorporate? First, the one that said that we should not recognize, we should go back on recognizing that there is an armed conflict. This is ridiculous. This has no rationality in proposing something like that. And the second one was that the leaders of the FARC had to go to jail before doing politics. That was also unacceptable. The rest were all accepted. Now, the Constitutional Court, when they approved the first referendum, said specifically, if this referendum is lost, you can present a new referendum. If it's lost, you can present a new agreement, but to Congress, which is the correct way to go about it, as the Constitution stipulates. Because they even didn't like very much that I was calling a referendum for the first agreement. So we did that using our laws, using our Constitution, and abiding by what the Constitutional Court said. And with the approval by an overwhelming majority in both houses, I think the legitimacy of that agreement is not put into question.
So we have a final sequence of questions. I think you've been very generous with your time. Thank you, Professor Santos. But, so the other person with the glasses in that quadrant, then we have near the front, and then we have one at the back. So you've got the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks for the coordination. Thank you for your talk. My name is Patricia, and I'm a student of philosophy here. And I'm interested in the themes of interdependence and solidarity to conversations of justice. And I recently went to a talk held by the Oxford Transitional Justice Network about, from a South African scholar named Fanny du Toit, who was talking about his theory of reconciliation in South Africa. And he said that one of the things that he sees as so important in that process was the recognition of interdependence between blacks and whites in apartheid South Africa. And that is something that Nelson Mandela very much brought in to the conversation and made the leaders of the apartheid government realize in order to move forward with that process. And I know that in Colombia, it's a very different situation. It's not one of apartheid, but one of armed guerrilla conflict. There is interdependence between those two sectors of the society, and it's something that comes out in the transitional justice process. So I wanted to hear more what you have to say about the interdependence of those members of Colombian society and how that played a role in reconciliation.
It's a very good question. Very good question. I will tell you something. It's important for everybody here because of the meaning that it has. When I became Minister of Defense 12 years ago, I went to a former commander of the army. He was a retired general at that time. I knew him quite well. He was a friend of my father. For advice, what advice can you give me? And he said the following thing. He said, I know because you've been talking about this, you want peace here in Colombia. And you are now responsible for waging war, which is you have to be effective. And it's a necessary condition to be able to get the peace you want. Treat the FARC not as enemies, but as adversaries. because the word enemy goes against the military honor. The enemy you have to destroy. The adversary you have to defeat. They are Colombians, they're human beings. If you treat them like that during the war, it will be easier to negotiate with them the peace. That was a marvelous piece of advice which I applied since the very first day. We used to have something terrible in Colombia in this war, the Vietnam body count. I changed that completely because I also learned that there is no more important asset for an armed force, for an army, than its legitimacy. And respecting the human rights, even of the adversaries, gives them much more strength. And we applied that since day one, after I got appointed Minister of Defense, and that helped me a lot. Now, for example, I invited the FARC to the presidential palace before leaving office. They are now citizens with rights. We have to see them as our equals. We cannot continue to see them as citizens of second class. That is what breeds hatred and breeds violence. And we have to go through a process of education. It's gonna take some time because many people still have a different paradigm. But there we must persevere.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Jorge Alejandro, medical doctor from Colombia, health policy researcher, and former Chevening scholar. My question to you is, what do you think are the incentives for like-minded young people to participate in politics? Keeping in mind that there's a lot of personal costs, like the corruption in our countries, also the populism rising in our region. So why do you think is it worthy for us to participate?
Well,
and to lead that as well?
Exactly what you're saying. Because we have corruption, because we have all those problems, you should participate. That's the best incentive. If we want to change things, we cannot simply allow things to go as usual. So engage. If the young people get engaged and want to change things, they will change things. I think you're seeing changes in Colombia. The last elections, the last Congress, is a big change. There's the resurgence of new forces starting, but you're seeing it. The fact that the FARC are not present anymore has given the left much more room, political room. Before, that was not the case. So I think we can continue to improve. Corruption is something that we have to continue to fight. In my government, we put in place probably the harshest legal tools at the disposal of the different entities that fight corruption. That's why they have been able to discover huge cases of corruption. We have to persevere there. I remember when the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Desmond Cameron, invited me to co-chair the first World Summit against corruption in London. And we discussed how fighting corruption is so difficult because you fight corruption, you discover corruption, and people think that it's your corruption that comes from way back. You are fighting it, and you have to manage that type of expectation or the reality versus what is perceived. But it's a matter of persevering also.
Thank you. And back row, ground floor.
Good afternoon. My name is Tatiana Torres. I am a current master's student of global politics at the London School of Economics. You mentioned that playing the referendum card as an option was a mistake. The results put the government in a position where you had to negotiate with the opposition and then include a number of requirements in the peace agreement. Then the peace agreement was signed, and you claimed that it was not perfect, but that it was certainly the best agreement both parts could get. My question is, if you could go back in time, would you still go through the same process and to get that best possible agreement? Or what would you do differently this time, if that were possible?
If I would look back, what would I have done differently in the peace process? Well, to start, in those procedures and the process that I mentioned, we decided, for example, to negotiate on a sequential basis instead of a simultaneous. That caused the negotiations to prolong a long time, and at the end, it in a way mixed with a political campaign, and that was very bad. For example, I would have changed that. It's always easy to look back, and you become a genius when you look back. You always say you could have done this or this other thing better. Probably this peace process has many things that are not perfect, but as I said, it's a product of a negotiation, and there's never a perfect peace process. I don't know if you have seen the movie called The Voyage. It's a conversation between Ian Paisley and the head of the IRA, and at the end, one says to the other, do you realize that we will be heroes in the eyes of the world, but traitors in the eyes of our own people? And in a way, this happens because of the complexity of making peace. History will take care of that, but at the very beginning, it's something that you have to live with and manage it and continue building the peace.
You're being very generous with your time. I think can you manage two more?
Sure.
And then we'll call it a close, I think. So I think there's one person over here, and then one person with her hand up on the left-hand side of the aisle. What?
Sorry, a small confusion regarding who was following. My name is Juan Felipe. I'm from Colombia as well, from Medellin. And I'm studying MC in conflict studies in LSE as well. And my question is, what would you think is our responsibility as civil society and your responsibility as a new civil society member to work towards reconciliation in our country, especially with such polarization that we're seeing right now?
I think that there's a lot that everybody can do on trying to change that polarized atmosphere. First, even the use of the language. It's very important to use a more agreeable language, referring to your adversary, to your political adversaries. I would say that it's very important to go back to those subjects that should unite the whole country, regardless of politics. It's always very important for a society to have common denominators. And I would suggest very strongly to recreate those common denominators and try to see if we can have a minimum consensus on those issues. That will facilitate the political the political management of the country, because what we're seeing now, not only in Colombia, we're seeing it everywhere, is that polarization is making politics a zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game is the contradiction of politics. Politics is transaction, is compromise. Zero-sum game is I take all or you take all. And then there's no compromise. And if there's no compromise, then politics loses its reason to be. So we must recuperate the art of transaction and compromise in politics. And that is by, one way to do it is by identifying those common denominators that, around which we can all agree to.
And a last question, I think you're holding the microphone.
Thank you so much, Professor Santos. Laura Pereira, former student of geography here. I wanted to ask a question about what you think of the viability or the long-term viability of the peace processes, given a context not just of poverty, but also of inequality. And that's sort of taking lessons from my own country of South Africa, where you see sort of after transition, 20-odd years down the line, where the underlying causes of conflict haven't actually been addressed, and that's starting to actually rise up again.
Sorry.
In the context of inequality, how sustainable is the peace in the long term, given inequality? Con inequidad, la paz va a seguir Ella es de Sudáfrica.
Okay. If I understood correctly, how does inequality and peace play each other? I'm sorry, but I didn't understand very well.
Sostenibilidad en el largo plazo de la paz, dado que hay inequidad.
Oh, okay. Okay, now I understand. That's why I said at the beginning that fighting poverty and inequality is a perfect complement to peace and to make peace a durable peace. Part of the reconciliation of the country is precisely to lower the levels of inequality. Inequality breeds hatred. There was a study published about a week ago. I saw it in one American newspaper that says how inequality has fed hatred in the United States in a very determined way. So in the long run, we must do every effort possible to bring inequality down, and that's one way to do it is to fight poverty and extreme poverty. Now, there is a problem also, and this is a collateral problem that many countries are having. When you bring people out of poverty, you take them out of a trap that they were in, and they had resigned themselves. They had thought for a long time that they were destined to be poor. When they come out of poverty, they have rights, and they understand that they have rights, and they want to exercise those rights, and the demands increase exponentially, and the capacity of the governments to satisfy those demands is always much lower. So there is one area where we have to invent ways to see how we can channel the demands of the middle class when poverty alleviation is very successful and the numbers are very high in the short run. This is a big challenge for a university like Oxford.
My apologies to those of you whose questions I either didn't see your arms or that I've not been able to fit in, but I think Professor Santos has been extraordinarily generous with his time. I think we've kept you talking for at least an hour and a half. I'd like to invite you, please, to join me in thanking him, both for that generosity, but for that very rare thing, which is seeing somebody bring together the skills of a politician. I hardly dare use the word statecraft in our current climate and context here in the UK, but statecraft together with a real appreciation of the research, the analysis that underpins sound policy making. So please join me in thanking him for a really inspiring lecture. Thank you.